Hey everybody, welcome to This Cultural Moment, a podcast about following Jesus in the post-Christian world. My name is John Mark Comer. I'm a pastor and teacher at Bridgetown Church in Portland, Oregon, and I'm here with my dear friend Mark Sayers, who is also a pastor, but really well known as a writer and cultural commentator and all-around genius/nice guy from the other side of the Western world, down under, even though that's a tourist thing to say, in Melbourne, Australia. And we're really happy to welcome you to Season 3 of this podcast.
So whilst we have the left and right, both create a very similar type of person. Someone who's highly individualistic, someone who has to find externals to find a sense of meaning, someone not restricted by binding commitments, someone who can move easily. It's like the gig economy of Uber has actually now become the gig identity of life.
Well, Mark, it's great to have you in town. We get you to Portland once or twice a year, and it's a Monday morning. We're sitting in the basement of First Baptist Church in the West End of downtown Portland. After a marathon day yesterday, you were teaching on the devil and using spiritual warfare by way of the metaphor of the Russian disinformation campaign via bots and algorithms, stuff that only Mark Sayers says. And it's so great to be with you, Mark. As we kick off Season 3, I was reminiscing this morning about when we first met, and we were at coffee somewhere and debriefing autobiographies, and you're a few years older than me as Gen X, but we both came of age a little bit in what at the time was called the missional movement, which is this kind of resurgence in church theory. And I remember you saying you were one of the early kind of leaders in that movement and writers in that movement, and were with a lot of the founders of that theory. And I remember you saying that you started to notice this trend where it started out as an attempt at deconstruction of church form. Like there was just this recognition 15-ish years ago that ways that we have been doing church in the West were no longer nearly as effective as they were in 1950 or 60s or the 70s. And now you have this whole new generation of Gen X and then behind that Millennials that were just not connecting really at church at all, and we're hemorrhaging young people. And so there was this sense that we need to change how church is done. And first it was about, alternative worship and let's light candles and play secular music and have alt-rock worship and sit in a round or whatever. And then it moved from there, and that's not to disparage any of that. Then it moved from there to actual church forms. What about the Sunday kind of people coming for an hour or two is less than what Jesus might have for us. But then you start to notice that trend that then people didn't stop there. A lot of your contemporaries went on to start to deconstruct the New Testament and the library of Scripture, and then from there orthodoxy, and then even past that to deconstruct the faith itself. And you had all these early, what started out as innovative pastors that ended up not even following Jesus, much less pastoring a church 10, 15 years down the road. And you started to notice this trend, and I just wonder how that is paradigmatic. Like it's just, I wonder if that's the crux of what we see across an entire generation in the Western world. And I remember you saying to me, what if I were to aim all that you came to this place 10 years ago or whatever? What if I were just to do church in a healthy way, like nothing crazy innovative, just a healthy local church? But what if I were to aim all of that angst and energy and intelligence and reading and research and thought and writing, not at deconstructing church or the New Testament or the faith, but rather at deconstructing secularism, which is a term that we defined in Season 2, and kind of the post-Christian Western world, which is what we defined in Season 1. And that's basically, from my vantage point, the last decade and a half of your life is just all of that IQ that you have, which is significantly higher than the rest of us, stuck on the middle of the IQ bell curve, but at that. And so essentially in this podcast, my job is just to siphon out like the genius, the muse of Mark Sayers for those of us on the middle of the bell curve, as we're just trying to work out how to follow Jesus in this kind of a cultural moment. And, we've had a number of podcast listeners ask, why don't you talk about life in small town or rural America or Canada or whatever it is, or life in a different socioeconomic reality? And the reality is we're not trying to be all things to all men through this podcast. I have no experience in rural America. You're not even American. Shocking. You're Australian, and this isn't a podcast just for Americans. A number of our listeners are from the UK and Ireland and Scandinavia and South Africa and Australia and New Zealand. And so really this is a little bit more meta level, 30,000 feet, but specifically for those of us that are trying to work out how to follow Jesus and even pastor a church in a secular post-Christian kind of city. So it's a Portland, it's a Melbourne, or increasingly it's anywhere and everywhere because of the iPhone and or whatever your phone of choice is. We had a conversation about that earlier. We have so much access to the Portland narrative, this kind of new emerging narrative of the West. So all that to say, Mark, deconstruction is an interesting thing, even to say that we're here to deconstruct the secular post-Christian narrative or whatever that we're all swimming in. Deconstruction is only helpful if it's followed by reconstruction of something that's better. And this is what I think is the great tragedy for so many of the Gen X or millennial kind of disenfranchised, deconstructionist church people. Like, are you building something that's even better? And the answer most of the time is no. And so talk to us about this. Where does this deconstructionism in our culture come from?
We'll just go back to our first meeting. It actually wasn't in a coffee shop. I don't know if you remember, but it actually was. Our first proper conversation was on the side of a cliff in Northern California.
Yeah, that's right.
There was a fire pit, and we sort of sat and watched the sea with whales at night or something. So it was much cooler.
Yeah, we're at
than
this
just
little
a coffee
pastors
shop.
gathering. Absolutely,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. So I remember that. Wow, it was it'd be a good movie scene, that shot. Yeah, look, the very much cultural tone is one of deconstruction. And if you look at our culture, we have this polarity between left and right. But what's really interesting is when you go to that 30,000 view, you see that there is a common in between both left and right at the moment, really, of deconstruction. So we can look at the left, which you go back to, particularly the 1960s, and you see this cultural movement where I guess the engine of Marxism and looking at culture and seeing its faults moves from an understanding of class to really one of looking at the questioning of inherited norms, traditions, authorities. And so you have this particular form of left thinking, which then goes and sees any form of structure as inherently oppressive, everything from language to categories. And that's now very deeply entrenched in what we think of the left. And what it does is create this kind of life where you have nothing to necessarily fall back on. It offers freedom, but then it doesn't really offer a sense of direction and how you should reconstruct a life. So it tells you what not to be, but not necessarily not what to be. Now, often that's posited against the right and the right as conservative. But what so many people have not noticed is that the right has fundamentally changed as well. Increasingly, the right is defined by, it's not something used so much here, but outside of America, the term neoliberal economics, which is often this very mutant form of capitalism where capital and money has become almost this sort of esoteric thing which moves across the world on computer screens. And interest rate can change here, and that has tremendous implications for people. And you look at cities which have been totally changed in their essence of what they look like, whole working class neighborhoods that disappear and are regentrified by this form of mutant capitalism, which also weirdly leaves people also rootless in a way. So whilst we have the left and right, when you actually look at the output that they're both create a very similar type of person. Someone who's highly individualistic, someone who lives in the moment, someone who has to find externals to find a sense of meaning, someone not restricted by binding commitments, someone who can move easily. It's like the gig economy of Uber has actually now become the gig identity of life.
Wow. And so, you were saying this earlier when we were chatting, that if you do your thing about the interns at MSNBC.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So, classically now you have this, particularly in American life, but it's similar all over the place in terms you have your left-wing newspaper and your right-wing newspaper, or your left-wing cable channel and your right-wing cable channel. In Australia, it could be the ABC versus Sky News. In the United States, it could be MSNBC versus Fox News. Now, what's really interesting, and this is not scientific, but I would guess that if you took 10 interns from MSNBC, which is seen as the progressive left-wing cable news channel, and you took 10 millennial interns from Fox News, and you sat them down and said, what's your opinions? They'd have very different divergent opinions. They would mouth, the left-wing talking points and the right-wing talking points. However, if you then studied them, looked at their spending habits, looked at the view of how they interact with time,
Sexuality,
even their
how
sexual practices, I reckon it'd be almost identical. So we have these sort of opinions we chuck out, but the actual life script across the political spectrum, when you get behind what's the content of the bumper sticker, it actually looks very similar. So it's actually this Western life script of radical individualism masked by ideology. But this is what people fail to see, how left-wing progressivism, as we understand it currently, and digital capitalism actually work together in symbiosis. And we see that in the university. We see that universities are engines of this neoliberal economic order at the same time as being the exact same place where the humanities department is offering this progressive vision. So how is it they work together, and how is these two seemingly opposed categories coming out of the same bases of higher learning is a really interesting question that not many people are asking.
Yeah, I think the most interesting book I've read so far this year was Why Liberalism Failed by Patrick Deenan, who is a political scientist from Notre Dame. I think he's a Catholic, but it's not written from the perspective of a religious bias. And this is his basic thesis, is that right and left are 80% the exact same thing. And the reason that our society is hemorrhaging right now is because they're both based on what he would call a faulty anthropology, which is this radical individualism, freedom redefined through the Enlightenment by the Founding Fathers from its traditional definition of both classic Greek thought down through Christian thought of, freedom from what the New Testament would call your flesh, not only from tyranny above you, but from your flesh inside of you, your appetites, your urge, your primal desire and instinct has been redefined to the ability to do whatever the heck you want, which is ironically what the New Testament calls slavery through its anthropology. And that's his whole basic point, is that left and right are essentially the same thing. Right just aims it at things like money, capitalism, the environment, left at sexuality and society and the obliterating of tradition and norm and religion. But they're essentially two sides of the same coin.
Yes. They're both deregulation. One is about complete deregulation of the market, and the other is about complete deregulation of tradition and norms and convention. But both leave you with this totally unregulated self, which ironically where this ends up is people then end up desperate for meaning, desperate to be led. And weirdly, the end game of this is that the siren song of the strong man or the strong woman after a while becomes seductive to people who live in this life which has no markers.
Yeah. So in what ways has this deconstructionism just so formed and shaped the way that we view the world in the West that we just assume it's normal?
Yeah. Well, even you look at how constantly we look at the rest of the world outside of the West through these lenses. Recently you had the Saudi dissident or Saudi journalist Khashoggi killed, and it's so fascinating to read that story, which is about complex internal divisions within the Muslim world and within Saudi society. And you're literally watching people go, oh, he's a progressive versus the conservatives. This is just ridiculous to look at it through this lens. So the world doesn't actually fit into the lens which we're trying to put over it. So there's this sense that what this does is it makes us see that the whole of life is about this deconstruction. There's an element where there needs to be parts of deconstruction. North Korean society needs to be deconstructed.
Yeah, there's a healthy place for it.
Totally. Racial structures which promote injustice need to be deconstructed. But the problem is that the mode has become just deconstructive, and when all there is deconstruction, you end up falling
into nowhere.
Nowhere.
I got a fascinating email this morning. It was not my normal Monday morning inbox experience, but it was from a Satanist who has come to our church the last few weeks and is essentially coming to faith in Jesus. Yeah. And he was highly intelligent and a great writer and a little bit funny and irreverent and clearly in process. And he made the point, he was quoting that book, help me on the title, the one that came out a year or two ago on the death of expertise. Was that the title?
Think Tom Nichols, yeah.
Yeah, just talking about, and of course Trump's a great example, he campaigned on this, like the death, how it used to be you would go to the expert in political science or economics or religion or whatever, and now that's over. Everybody's an expert. And he was saying how he was educated to believe that he, as a 16-year-old kid sitting in a public high school, has every right and responsibility to disagree with the PhD's view of this, that, or the other, and how that carried over into his view of God, that he began to just view himself on, just as he was taught and encouraged by his educational system to think of himself as just as responsible of a player in the opinion meritocracy as the PhD in whatever, or the president or the senator
Yes.
or the pastor or the whatever, and he should disagree and push back, that he carried that view of the world over into his view of God.
Yes.
And he began to just say, well, I know better than God around morality, around society, around religion, around whatever, and push back. And then he got to the point where he literally said, but then I began to realize that my worldview was stupid and was leading me to death and not to life. And again, this is somebody coming out of Satanism. Now, that's maybe an extreme example, but I just felt like, man, that is such an acute, like, prognosis. This isn't from some, like, Christian, like, apologetic. This is somebody who's fresh in this moment and coming out of this moment. And he was saying, it left me with nothing.
Yes.
It left me racked by anxiety, PTSD, stressed out of my mind, no markers to know where to go forward. And is that some of what we're seeing right now, and some of
Yes.
the anger and the anxiety that is just the new normal that we see across the landscape? Do you think some of it's rooted in that?
Well, part of our, again, you're right to mention anthropology, because this goes back to understanding how we work as humans. You go into a building, like just walking down here into the basement of First Baptist. I've not been here for several months, and I sort of had a mental picture of some of it. But the way you just came down, I didn't know how to get here. Like, we just walked through some room. I just saw a giant pizza maker.
It's like a labyrinth
It is
downstairs.
a labyrinth.
This building is older than Oregon statehood, and
Totally.
it's crazy in the basement.
Now, if I didn't have you as an authority to follow, who knew how to get down here, I would have developed, I mean, I wouldn't have freaked out because I knew I'd find you eventually. But without any indicators or markers or any expertise of someone who's gone here before, I would find myself in a place of anxiety, not knowing where to go, and actually would find myself lost. So there's been rebellion against oppressive authority, which is right and understandable, but then it's just become a rebellion against any authority and even any received tradition. So you have a received tradition, you've been here before, you know how to get down to this room. I have to respect that. If I'm going to climb Mount Everest, I don't want a radical egalitarian group of people climbing Mount Everest. I want to follow the Sherpa who knows how to get to the summit.
Yes.
And I'm going to follow that guy and listen to everything he does because I don't want to die.
Yeah, you know, we've just done some work on this in our recent teaching series around mental maps in the language of psychology. And, you know, one author I read used the exact same metaphor. We all have mental maps, how to get to work in the morning, or in this case, how to get to the crazy little podcast room in the basement of First Baptist, where you have this, and if your map is right, you get there, and if your map is wrong, you end up lost. But we have mental maps for all of life. We have mental maps for sexuality, for money, for family, for gender, for religion, for socioeconomics, maps by which we navigate the reality or our perception of reality that is life. And if your mental map is right, if it corresponds to the truth in the language of the New Testament, to reality, you end up at your destination. If it's wrong, you end up lost. But the crazy thing about mental maps is if you follow that metaphor through, by definition, it has to come from somebody else who's been to the destination. You've never been there, hence the name mental map. So you don't know how to get there. So it has to come through a religion, a tradition, a philosophical or a psychological tradition. It has to come from somewhere outside of yourself, hence why Jesus, of course, comes as a rabbi, as a teacher, as a luminary. But when you obliterate all of that and everybody starts with a blank page, you end up with a lot of confusion, in my experience.
Yes, and we're seeing that outplay. I mean, my brother sent me this video of, I think it's the punk band Fear in like 1981, and they played some like late night show, and it was just this incredible video where they just like 40 of their fans came and just trashed the entire studio, and they cut the transmission halfway through. And there's part of me which just loved it, this very like, you know, structured environment, and these kids just going crazy. There's part of me, I don't know, maybe it's like the Gen Xer in me that likes to see that, but I don't want to see that in government. I don't want to see that in road safety. There's an element where culture has these releases where the sort of valve was released. If you look at the carnival in history, if you look at, you know, various holidays or just these moments where you go to a sports game and you get to yell, which you don't normally get to do. But what's happened is our whole of culture's become a release. And when the whole of culture is a release and freedom, you start to look for control in the wrong
because
places.
It's anarchy on the ground.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so to kind of wrap up this episode 1, where do you see, so you're saying that this deconstructionism, if I'm hearing you right, is rooted in this Western redefinition of anthropology, of what it means to be a human being, as a radical individual, this
Yes.
hyper-autonomous, all authority, whether it take the form of the Bible or the church or the Pope or your gender or your family or your class or whatever, all of that is by nature oppressive. Therefore, throw off the oppression and recreate yourself from the ground up over and against anybody and anything else. And then you end up with radical freedom, but with no maps. Like you just have this blank slate and you're lost. How has this radical individualism, which is kind of the second side of anti-authoritarianism, don't tell me what to do or who to be, how has this shaped our own expression of life with Jesus, our discipleship to Jesus and life in the church? Where do you see this starting to deconstruct our discipleship and our experience in church?
Yes. So I see there's a few different groupings. The most prominent of them is there's a definite group, as you mentioned, the setup of this, of people that I know directly, indirectly, who then went on this thing of deconstructing. But the problem is once you go to deconstruction, and I think there was, like I have lots of friends who deconstructed some elements of church structure and still love Jesus, still Orthodox, still passionate about mission, love those guys, champion them.
They're just not doing the Sunday thing in the same
exactly.
way. Which is kind of what we both signed up for at the beginning.
Yeah, and totally, like that's, no problem there. But then you have other people who that just became the first stop on a process of deconstruction. There's a little bit to understanding the dynamics of revolution. You notice that Engels, who wrote with Marx, had this fantastic saying, and I'm paraphrasing, where he said, the fate of the revolutionary is to wake up to find that the revolution you wish for has come, but it's nothing like you expected. And so we've seen that. You see the French Revolution where...
You see that all through history.
Yes, let's cast off the oppression of the French aristocracy. And you have the Girondins, but then the Girondins, there's another revolution by the Jacobins, and then you go a little bit further forward and you've got Napoleon crowning himself and heading out across Europe to attack everyone in the name of freedom.
Yeah, the antithesis.
Yeah, or the Arab Spring, it's like these bloggers and sort of liberals.
See it a lot in the African nations.
Yes.
Yep,
And then
free from the colonialism,
Exactly.
but then it ends up this mess.
Yeah, totalitarian. And so there's this sense that there's a point where deconstruction for deconstruction's sake, and particularly in a time where the dominant social posture and mood is one of deconstruction, at some point you're going to end up at a form of order and control that you don't like. What is better is to be proactive and look for an authority you can follow. The authority we can follow is Jesus. And so I see some people who don't go that whole journey, but what they're trying to do is a mashup where I like Jesus, I want some control in my life and some order and someone to follow, but also want to have that deconstructive radical individualism. So they're the people who've got a foot in both camps, and like those two, or a foot on both islands, and those islands are going further apart, and eventually they're going to do the splits.
Yeah.
It's going to hurt. And so I think that's actually probably the majority of people.
Yeah. And in our church, I mean, that's like the number one pastoral, and I love our church to pieces, but that is the acute issue. People that are into Jesus, but yet have been so shaped by the radical individualism, the redefinition of gender and sex and marriage and all of that, and it's the foot in both camps and just that tension.
Yes. I mean, and what's really interesting is I just wonder whether we've come to this point where in 1984, I think the main character is Winston Smith, and his active revolution against this oppressive, controlling...
You're talking about the novel 1984.
The novel 1984.
Not the year. Yep,
yeah. He has this, it's like this totalitarian state that Orwell wrote about.
That everybody's talking about again now.
Yes, it's selling
in
like
the Trump
hotcakes.
era. Yep.
He has this diary he writes in, and that's his active revolution, to have this internal life, and they can't control his inner world. What's different about this moment is that these phones on the desk in front of us are algorithmically programmed by the smartest minds on earth to actually shape our inner worlds, and they have reshaped our inner worlds. So we're at this point now where I almost feel like as Christians, we're sending people out going, hey...
We're not nearly as autonomous as we think we are.
Not as autonomous.
We've been so pre-programmed by our phone, by the media, by the worldview.
Yes. And people who know your desires almost better than you do, who know your emotions. We're more connected to other people.
Because, again, it's linked to capitalism.
Yes.
Because there's a way to make money off of you through your phone. Yeah.
There's this sense that someone's sitting there silently, not moving. We will still interpret as human beings as they're saying something, because we're so in tune to what other people are thinking and feeling non-verbally. So we're far more connected to others than we realize. We're far more feelings-driven than we realize. We're far more subconscious than we realize. So there's this sense that we need to then find an order to live under, find an authority to live under, but it must be one which is life-giving. So Jesus comes to humiliate the principalities and powers of this world.
The corrupt power structures.
Totally.
To deconstruct.
Totally comes to deconstruct. And there's a definite deconstruction that God is doing in the world.
I mean, think about Jesus' teaching. He's just shredding some of the religious
Absolutely.
paraphernalia and just so much deconstruction through that.
Absolutely. So one of the sort of scarier things we're seeing on the right of the emergence of the right, and particularly amongst younger people, I mean, a lot of the statistics that say for the next younger generation coming up that they're the most conservative generation since the Depression.
Yeah.
So they're like, this world, there's no markers, so I'm going to create them. So I don't want that necessary. I don't want tradition for tradition's sake. I don't want to return to structures that are oppressive. I don't want to then deconstruct every single authority. We're literally at a point where it's Jesus' way or the highway.
So that's the reconstruction you're saying,
Yes.
is like at some point you have to come under somebody else's mental map.
Yes.
You need authority. You need a received sense of wisdom about some navigation points, some landmarks for the journey to the good life.
Yes.
And for us, that's Jesus and our life together in community. I love it. Well, we'll keep the conversation going. Thanks for being with us on episode 1 of season 3 of This Cultural Moment. We're still a new podcast. If you want to tweet this out, Instagram this out, throw it up online, tell your friends, tell your family, write a review on iTunes, any of that stuff would be really helpful. There's no marketing campaign. There's no staff. Neither of us get paid to do this. We're just sitting in the basement, drinking hot coffee, having a good time, talking about life in the modern world. Thanks for listening.